Who are my project stakeholders? The types of project has a bearing on how and who our stakeholders are, how we identify them and who they are. If we look at a predictive environment, for example, we find that our stakeholders are going to be involved with us periodically. We need them at key points in time that we can properly get the information that we need and use that information. In a predictive or a traditional project, you can see that stakeholders are involved at specific milestones right here. In other words, I need a stakeholder to help me identify the requirements for my project. I've got to have them. Our requirements for the project come from the stakeholders. In an iterative or an incremental type project, you can see that key stakeholders are regularly involved in the project. In some cases, they may be working right along beside us, but we're always getting constant feedback from the customer and the stakeholders, and that's necessary for us to develop the project properly. But look at Agile. In Agile, key stakeholders are continuously involved in the project. They may, in fact, be sitting there working right along beside us. Their input into the project requirements are critical. We cannot do without them. You see, in an iterative or incremental or agile environment, we don't necessarily have a well-defined scope of the project. As you can see in this next slide here, two different animals here. In a traditional or predictive type project, you can see the qualification as stakeholders are involved periodically at key milestones. But look at our scope down here. Our scope is fixed. We know what we're going to be delivering. We have spec'd out in our plan exactly what we're going to be delivering. But look at the Agile projects. In an Agile project, our scope is iterative. It's variable. We start off on a project and we don't know what the scope is what's going to really end up being the deliverable, the final deliverable. We don't know what all the features will be, those types of things as far as the scope for the deliverable. The stakeholders have to be continuously involved. Two primary approaches, two different levels of stakeholder involvement. You've seen this slide. Those of you that have attended before have seen this slide before. Once we have a project sponsor, that is money bags. That's the person paying for the project. And we have the justification for the project. We have the business documentation. Then we're going to start initiating the project. In other words, we have our project charter. We have a project. Then we're going to start identifying stakeholders. Ideally, we're going to identify those stakeholders early in the project. If I miss a key stakeholder and I'm in the middle of the project and I all of a sudden discover a key stakeholder, then that's going to drive a lot of changes to my project. And of course, we don't want that. We want to make sure that we identify the stakeholders right here at the beginning of the project, right after we have our justification for the project and we have the funding and all for our project. Sure enough, as we're planning and as we're executing, we may uncover some other stakeholders, but hopefully we've covered all of the key stakeholders that will give us the bulk of the requirements for our project. This is what we call the 10 by 5 by 49. This is what has set aside in the 6th edition of the PMBOK guide, and this is a process oriented. The 7th edition of the PMBOK guide, I did a seminar on that some time back, and I'll probably do another one later on, but the actual 7th edition is more of a how-to. It has a different approach entirely. But we need processes to be able to manage projects. And when we look at this, this is the way that it comes in under the PMBOK Guide 6th edition. Today, we're going to be talking about stakeholders right down here. Right there, stakeholders. We have 4 different processes. Identify stakeholders, plan stakeholder engagement, manage stakeholder engagement, and monitor stakeholder engagement. We'll talk about those 4 different processes. Who is a stakeholder? One time I was doing some work for a lady here in Greenville, and she was setting up a PMO. And I asked her, I said, who are your stakeholders? Well, she said, my boss, my boss's boss, my boss's boss's boss, and on up the line. And I said, no. Who are the people that will benefit from this project? Who are the people that are affected by it? Who are the users? And she said, well, that's these people. A stakeholder is anyone that is positively or negatively impacted by the project, or they think they're going to be impacted by the project. They have an interest in the project for whatever reason, perhaps because they're affected or whatever reason. They think they have an interest in the project. They're your suppliers, for example. Your team is a actual stakeholder. Your customers, whoever they may be. Yes, managers and supervisors are stakeholders, but let's face it, if you don't keep the key people involved and happy with the project that are going to be the users and are being affected by it, then that feedback is going to get to your bosses and they're not going to be happy with the results of the project. The term stakeholder takes on a whole big realm of people or positions that might be impacted. And we, as project managers, have to identify the correct people. How do we go about that? Well, let's go on and then we'll talk about that. As we identify stakeholders, we're going to enter those stakeholders. There's a process called identify stakeholders, and that is the focus of that process is to identify the stakeholders that might be present for this project. The output would be the stakeholder register, and this stakeholder register is going to contain a lot of information on our actual stakeholders. It lists the people, the groups, or the organizations that are impacted or that may be impacted by the project itself. Let's look at this flow chart here. I took the 10 by 5 by 49, for example, and I put it in an order that is more logical. And this process flow we cover in the practical project management course, and a lot of this material comes directly from that course. But basically at the project charter level, which says I have a project, it specifically kicks off the project. We are going to start identifying stakeholders even right here. Our project charter is going to have some stakeholders that have been identified for us. We have identified, or they were given to us by whoever created the project charter. Once we have that project charter, our first goal is to focus on stakeholders. Identify them. Understand who are the stakeholders. Who's going to be impacted most likely by this project? Who has the highest interest? What is their position with regards to the project? Then we identify the stakeholders, enter it into the stakeholder register, and then we plan stakeholder engagement. How are we going to keep those stakeholders engaged? You know, to have a successful project, you have to keep your stakeholders engaged throughout the life of the project. Then, once we have this stakeholder engagement plan right here, when we're executing the project, we're going to manage stakeholder engagement. In other words, I'm going to execute that stakeholder engagement plan. I have a plan, I'm executing the plan, I'm going to monitor and control stakeholder engagement to make sure that I'm moving my stakeholders in the right direction. Those are the processes of. Let's go to the next one. Identify stakeholders. This is the process where we identify the people, groups, organizations that may be impacted by the project. We're going to reach out for inputs into this process so that we can better understand who our stakeholders are. For example, our project charter is going to give us some stakeholders. The business documents we talked about, such as the business case and the benefit management plan, those also will provide us some insight on stakeholders. At this point, we don't have a lot with the other project management plans completed, but as they become available, we will also reference those. Then we have documents such as issues log. Again, at a later point in the project, as we're executing, some of that information may be important. But here's another one, an agreement, a contract. If we are doing this project for someone else, we have a contract to complete it, then that agreement may identify for us some of the key stakeholders that we need to keep involved. And then our organization chart, for example, coming out of OPA, or EEF, whichever the case may be. We're looking everywhere to identify stakeholders. Then we'll use various tools to help us understand the stakeholders, and certainly we will update our primary output, which is our stakeholder register. And as we identify new stakeholders later on, we may in fact issue change requests to record those, and then we will constantly update documents and project plan. What we're talking about here is a traditional or a predictive type project. But this same approach really applies to Agile, except our Agile customers, our key stakeholders, are going to be more evident because they're going to be well known, they're going to be working with us, contributing throughout the life of the project. The stakeholder register gives us a list of all the stakeholders on the project, such as team members, applicable managers, users, anyone who's impacted by the project, anyone who has interest in the project, think they have interest in the project. They can be positively or negatively impacted. I had a friend that was working on he worked for a big corporation, and they were redoing their sales process. And he didn't know it, but he worked himself right out of a job. He was definitely negatively impacted, but he didn't know it because he was on the project team and still didn't know it. Keeping stakeholders is critical to the project's success. You want a successful project, keep your stakeholders engaged. Vital. We have to make sure we have all the stakeholders identified because they are the ones that give us the key components, key requirements for our project. The stakeholder register, we use that and we assess the stakeholders for their impact and interest on the project. We have to understand the needs of the stakeholders and meet those needs. We also have to establish communications requirements. That's done under communications, which we're not going to cover today, other than to say that communications to stakeholders is vital. We have to stay in touch with them, and we're going to develop a communications management plan that will tell us how often we communicate to them, what they want communicated, in what format, who's responsible, and the frequency. That stakeholder or communications management plan, we will interview each stakeholder and understand their communication requirements and make sure that we're satisfying that. We develop a stakeholder engagement plan, and then we manage that plan. In other words, we execute that plan. Here is a chart that shows where stakeholders can come from. You can see your project manager, you're a stakeholder. And then you reach out into the big sphere, and you're going to beat the bushes, basically. That's what I call it, beating the bushes, to come up with the stakeholders. Look, our suppliers, our customers, end users, sponsors, governing bodies, steering committees, PMOs, project team, managers, and the resource managers are all potential stakeholders on this project. We have to understand that potential, and we have to understand, and then we have to analyze those stakeholders to determine things like their current position on the project, what they currently feel about it. You may have some people that are negative to the project. Where am I going to move them to? What's my desired position for them? Very important. Here's our stakeholder register. And you can see that we have the name, their position and role, contact information, communication requirements, project expectations, and then project status classification. That's all important information for us to know. If I look at the stakeholder register, I'm probably going to change pointers. Here we go. This is what a live stakeholder register looks like. And what you see here is the practical project management course, some of the entries that you make in that if you decide to take that at some point. But anyway, again, it has the name, it has the position and role, contact information, communication requirements, project expectations, and then the classification. As we do the stakeholder register, we're going to add to this stakeholder register additional information. As we analyze the stakeholders, we will do an analysis on them. As we develop our stakeholder engagement plan, we will have more information also there on the stakeholders themselves. The next process is called planned stakeholder engagement. We know who the stakeholders are. Then we have to develop strategies for those stakeholders. We have to analyze them. We have to understand them. This is provided throughout the project. We will do an analysis on a stakeholder, their current position, the desired position, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But this is going to give us the strategies that we will use to engage the stakeholders throughout the project lifecycle. And these strategies are going to be based on the stakeholders' needs, their interest, and their potential impact on the project. Their importance, you could say. Here is the inputs into planned stakeholder engagement. When we look at the project charter, yeah, that's an important input. If we have a contract, yeah, that's going to be an important input. But right here is our project stakeholder register right here. And that's going to be the key input into this process. In this process, we're going to go through all the analysis using various tools to prioritize and rank, to understand the stakeholders, using things like a stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And data gathering and all that. It will be tools that we will use to help us analyze the stakeholders that are on the stakeholder register. And then on the output side, we have our stakeholder engagement plan. Once the stakeholder has been identified, then we establish their current position, their desired position, and we use whatever tools that we need to, such as stakeholder engagement matrix and all, to accomplish that. We have then our stakeholder engagement plan that is important on the project. We plan for each stakeholder, how they'll be moved from current position to desired, and we're going to rank them and we're going to prioritize them. Here is the stakeholder engagement plan. Stakeholder engagement plan. We have the stakeholder, they're unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, or leading. That is their attitude towards the project. We're going to do two things with this. Number one, we're going to establish their current position. If they are currently unaware, then our desired position might be neutral. We would put a D under neutral and a C under aware, so that we understand where they are. And then we're going to talk about how to move that stakeholder, how to engage them and move them from that current position to the planned position. Let's look at this filled out form here. You can see John is currently leading, and he's currently, that is the desired position. Nancy is currently neutral, but the desired position is leading. and I list her comments or concerns here. And then you have Pete, Hank, and Sue, the children in this case, and their current position as well as their desired position. Then we go to the next slide, the next page, if I can get to it. There we go. There are no pending stakeholder changes here. It's important for us to understand if there are pending stakeholder changes. Maybe one of your key stakeholders is going to be moving to another position or another company, and that has to be backfilled with someone else, and you want to get to know that person and an understanding of them. And then what are the relationships between the stakeholders? This is more than a personal relationship. This is a relationship professionally, perhaps personally, but just an understanding of the relationships. Then you develop a stakeholder engagement approach. In the case of John, that was already in the desired position of leading, we said we'd keep him in the decision-making loop and communicate frequently with him. Nancy, be in communication with her and focus on relieving her anxiety regarding the move. And in this, we are addressing how we're going to actually engage those stakeholders and move them from the current position to the desired position. Then later on, we're going to come back and we're going to monitor it to see how they're progressing. And then we will update our engagement plan if we need to, if they're not progressing as we had anticipated. This is important. First of all, we have a plan. We monitor that plan and we make sure that it's working. And if it's not working, we'll take action to address it to make sure that we are keeping those stakeholders engaged. We're not going to move a stakeholder from a current position of negative to a positive position of leading overnight. But periodically we check to see if they are progressing and they are moving towards the desired position. That is the stakeholder engagement plan. Then we have this assessment matrix here. And this is what I was talking about: unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, and leading. John is currently unaware. This is not the same John as we were looking at earlier, by the way. Our desired position for John is neutral. How am I going to move him from unaware to neutral? Sam is currently resistant. We want Sam to be leading. Neutral, Ann is neutral. We want Ann to be supportive. We're going to update our stakeholder register and our stakeholder engagement plan to reflect this type of information. When I was doing a project in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and in this project I was dealing with the owner who was the sole owner of the business, and he had 2 sons, and they were involved in the business. I went in there to do a new product introduction assessment. Small project, 1-week project, with a potential for a longer multi-month project to come about as a result of this if it was successful. Well, when I went in there, I knew the owner was leading. He was really, really on top of it. He wanted it. But I also knew that he respected his son's opinion. One of the sons was a process engineer, and he worked on site at the factory. And I would say he was probably neutral to positive in that range. And he was good to work with, and there wasn't any problems with him or anything. But then the younger son was a new product development person, and he resided in Minneapolis. And he was very negative to the whole thing. He didn't want me in there. And I was not focused on him. I did not develop a plan for engagement. And he was very negative all the way through that week that I was there. I talked to him a couple of times. Personally, I didn't like him. Have you ever had anybody you just don't like? Well, this was one of those guys. And let my emotions get in my way of good sense as a project manager. And I didn't try to move him from that negative position to a supportive position. And I didn't get the follow-up project because of that. The stakeholders have to be engaged in the project. If not, you're creating and digging a hole for yourself if you don't plan how you're going to engage them and actually work on getting them engaged. I know that. I've experienced it. We have what's called a salience model. A salience model is basically based on three things: power, legitimacy, and urgency. We update the stakeholder to establish the importance of each stakeholder. If we look at this, we can see number 2 is unaware. Number 2 is out in la-la land. Number 2 is going to get a score of 0. Number 3 has power. He's getting a score of 1. Number 5 has legitimacy and power. Number 5 is going to get a score of 2. Number 7 has the same thing, has power and urgency. But look at number 4. Number 4 has power, urgency, and legitimacy. And number 4 is going to get the highest score, which is a 3. That helps us to understand the importance of each stakeholder to the project. We have other ways of scoring people, and there's a matrix that we use, assessment, where we rank them and develop strategies based on where they fall in the grid. And there are other means that we can use to understand the stakeholders. But the importance of this is to make sure you are aware of their needs, make sure you're aware of their power, their legitimacy, their urgency, their current position, the desired position, and that you have this plan that you're going to be executing that will get them on board with the project. That is necessary and important. Stakeholder analysis. Stakeholder analysis is we have each stakeholder and we have established their interest and their influence. That would be the salience model score. And then their position, which would be the current and desired position. Unaware, positive, negative. When we look at this, we see that John had high interest, high influence, and he was in a leading position. Nancy had high interest, high influence, and she was in a neutral position. Pete had low interest, medium influence to low, and Pete was resistant. Was Hank and Sue. I have gathered a lot of information on my stakeholders. I have my plan on how I'm going to engage them, and I'm ready to start managing my stakeholders. When we manage the stakeholders, that's the process, manage stakeholder engagement. We are going to execute the plan. Remember the how-to. How we're going to move stakeholder A from a current position of negative to a desired position of positive. We have that plan in place. We're going to execute that plan. So when we execute that plan, we may find that some parts of it are not working. If that's the case, then we would issue a change request to modify that plan so that we can meet the stakeholders' expectations and meet their needs. We address issues, and we then certainly foster the stakeholder engagement. And this would be done through that primary output of change request. I think we have a seminar coming up, I don't recall what month, but on changes, and we'll talk about changes in that seminar. Here's managed stakeholder engagement, the process. We're going to have several important inputs here. At this point, we would have our communications management plan. We would have our risk management plan, our stakeholder engagement plan, certainly, because that's what we're going to execute, and change management plan. And we would have several documents also. When we're managing people, conflict is always an issue. Not always necessarily between you and the stakeholders. It could be, but it could be between stakeholders. And even between stakeholders, you're going to have to manage that conflict. You're going to have to deal with the culture. You're going to have to do negotiations. You're going to have to be actively observing and talking and understanding what's going on in your project. And then, of course, every company has a certain level of politics, some more than others. And then the communications. Did you realize that 90% of a project manager's time is spent communicating? Not sitting behind a computer, typing in Microsoft Project or something like that. But it's 90% is communicating, talking with the stakeholders, talking with team members, listening, managed by walking around, observation, conversation, writing memos or doing reports. All those things would fall under the communications 90%. 50% of that time is spent communicating to the project team. On the output side of this, we're going to have our change request as the primary output, and then we'll update any plans and any documents that we might need to as a result of what we've learned in this process. In a traditional or predictive type project, which we're basically talking about, in a project like that, we have a tool that's called progressive elaboration. Progressive elaboration says I don't know everything about my project at the beginning of the project. As I'm going through the project, I learn more. And when I learn more, I update the plans and the documents to reflect that new information I learned. That's why we have these updates listed here. We update as appropriate. Managed stakeholder engagement is key to a successful project. Keep stakeholders informed, understand the stakeholders, be aware of stakeholder issues and aggressively work those issues, manage relationships, communicate with stakeholders, and keep the stakeholders actively involved in the project. Monitor stakeholder engagement. We have a plan. First of all, we've identified stakeholders. We have a plan on how we're going to engage those stakeholders. We're executing that plan. We're going to monitor to make sure that the plan itself is working. And monitoring and controlling processes, we always are looking for variance. Is there a variance? Is there a difference between plan and actual? Plan results versus actual results. We verify actual stakeholder relationships and the engagement matches the plan. And we have what we call work performance data. That's an input. That's the actual results. And then we have the plan. We compare those two to see if there is a variance. If there is a variance, maybe the plan for John isn't working as intended, then we go back and we revise that plan through the issuance of a change request to correct that plan. Work performance data, and I think we've already covered that process. Well, that'll come out in the change process too. But work performance data comes from execution of the project. Direct and managed project work, which is where we execute it. And that WPD is how much money we've spent, where we are on the schedule, how much of the scope we have done, how many defect repairs we've done, anything like that would be the WPD. That WPD is an input into the monitoring and controlling processes. In this case, I would pull from that WPD the information that's related to the stakeholders, and then I would look at that and compare that to the plan and see if there's a variance. The act of doing that gives me what's called work performance information. And work performance information is the key output. That is the analyzed data. That's the data that has been analyzed. That's the results of what we found. Monitoring stakeholder engagement. We have here, of course, as our primary input, our stakeholder engagement plan, our stakeholder register, and our WPD right here. And we will analyze the actual results to the plan. On the output side, we have the WPI, and then we have change requests. That's monitor stakeholder engagement. Monitor stakeholder engagement begins once the stakeholder engagement begins. Once the stakeholder is engaged in the project, then we start monitoring the actual results to the planned results. We validate that the stakeholder engagement plan is being followed. That's a key component of any monitoring and controlling process. Is the plan being followed? And is it providing the results that we're trying to achieve? So we validate stakeholder engagement plan is working. Our objective here is to minimize stakeholder issues. Issues are a problem. Issues can be small, and if we don't address those issues, they can grow into a mountain. So you could go from a molehill to a mountain. And that's why we want to minimize stakeholder issues and make sure that all issues are being worked. We optimize the stakeholder engagement. We want to smooth it out, make sure they're engaged, solve any issues that there might be or any potential problems that we might have. We document what's called lessons learned. In a project, throughout the life of the project, we document lessons learned. Lessons learned says, I learned a lesson at that Fergus Falls job, right? That lesson I learned was always have a stakeholder engagement plan. Always address individuals that are contrary to the project. That was a lesson learned. That was recorded. If I have another project, I go back and I look at lessons learned. I review it. I see where the problems were. And I make sure I don't repeat those problems. Or I see where I did some things that were really great and I want to repeat them. And then I can repeat those in future projects, perhaps that are similar to the one that I just finished. And then we implement continuous improvement. As a project manager, you are always involved in continuous improvement. You want to continuously improve the processes, the way you're doing your projects, to fine-tune it, to make sure that your projects are performing at a high standard and a high efficiency. Monitor stakeholder engagement.